The 2019 elections brought with it a slowdown in economic activity. Moving into 2020, there was that optimism that we could see, albeit a slight pickup in economic activity in Nigeria. So I spoke to an economist, a representative of the telecoms industry, and also a spokesperson for the private sector in Nigeria to get a sense of their thoughts on how the economy has played out in the first quarter and the expectations for the second quarter.
I don't want to talk about the first quarter without talking about the fourth quarter. Fourth quarter, we came up with a GDP of 2.55. But if you look at that, if you decompose the GDP, you had 12 activities out of 46 that outperformed the GDP average. And that average growth rate in those 12 activities were 5.63%. But the other 32 activities that underperformed the GDP grew at minus 1.08%. So if you take away those 12 sectors or 12 activities, the economy was already in a recession. It was only propped up by oil activity. Therefore, now superimpose the Q1 and juxtapose coronavirus, airport closure, border closure, contraction in activities, right? Closure of hotels. You can now see that Q1 definitely is going to be negative growth in Q1.
Well, first, there is a major disruption now, supply chain disruption. Many of the manufacturers depend on imported inputs, intermediate products, particularly from Asian countries and particularly from China. So there's a major disruption that will take some time to normalize. Then secondly, because they also depend a lot on foreign inputs, exchange rate depreciation will mean that the cost of inputs will go up. And that means that eventually their cost of production will go up. And if that happens, their prices ultimately will go up. And given the kind of demand situation that we have, because purchasing power is also getting weak, because as a result of all of this crisis, the economy is also slowing down. Demand and purchasing power will also become weak. So when you have a situation where you have a weak purchasing power, dealing with high cost of products in the market, you can see that it creates a very challenging situation for the manufacturers.
It's been positive. And why do I say that? Essentially, we've had a lot of people going online. We've had schools obviously being shut. So therefore, they have to do remote e-learning. And that obviously ensures that there's an increase in data usage. Data usage at the moment, and with the price decreases that we've observed, has meant that there's going to be a lot more consumption. So it looks like it's come together. Data price increases by some of our players with the increase in terms of now changes in consumer behavior.
My view is that the second quarter is likely to be very challenging, because right now a whole lot is happening with our macroeconomic fundamentals. And because we have an economy that is highly import dependent, if you look at our manufacturing sector, for instance, this is a highly import dependent sector. That perhaps explains why, the sector accounts for less than 10% of GDP. And for an economy that is highly import dependent, and for a sector that is highly import dependent, because of what is happening first to the oil price, to the reserves, and eventually to the exchange rates, is going to dislocate and disrupt quite a lot of things in the real sector of the economy. So it will take some time, for things to normalize, of course, depending on how quickly we're able to resolve this public health crisis around the coronavirus issue.
If it continues, we're not really sure where it will go, because obviously a lot of these things are temporary, and we've never actually tried all stay at home and consume the data. Obviously, networks have to have an increase in capacity. There's the demand side in terms of devices, and the devices, unfortunately, in terms of China's export, in terms of export from Korea into the country, as we're 100% dependent on imports of devices and components, and the devices may also ensure that there might be a flattening going forward. But Q2 is still positive unless this thing does go further beyond some of the metrics that we put in place in terms of demand.
Second quarter, the impact of the supplementary budget, because supplementary budget will be approved in Q1, it will contract activity, but the expenditure contraction is to 9 trillion from 10.58, while the revenue contraction is much more profound. Now, we would look at contraction in government expenditure. We'll look at the balance of trade negative figure of $3 billion. we will see the current account deficit as well, and we'll see depletion of reserves to about 34, maybe $33 billion. That will be the floor, hopefully, if we have a mild to moderate attack. For the ordinary Nigerian, you see the GDP has 4 components. Government expenditure, down. Investment, flat to reduced. Consumption, down. But consumption has been helped because you brought down the price of petrol by 20 naira. 20 naira multiplied by 60 million liters a day gives you an average around 600 billion naira increase in aggregate consumption. So you have the plus on aggregate consumption, but you have the negative on VAT, contraction of activity. So generally speaking, Q2 will be, in our judgment, flat, and then you begin to see a recovery. You now begin to see reopening of the airport, reopening of schools, reopening of government institutions, and a general recovery in activity. And in Nigeria, the recovery in activity is always more rapid than the closure of activity. So, because Nigerians are optimistic and full of the informal sector, so we think that you are going to see a very, very aggressive and, rapid growth in the Q3 to make up for Q1 and Q2. By Q2, we'll be in a recession, but by Q3, there will be a recovery, and if not flatlining, and then by Q4, you're out of it.